Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. The origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, in light of the Department of Energy's recent announcement that they do believe that it came from a lab leak in Wuhan, China. Well, duh. Many of us have been saying that for years, and we haven't been pulling that theory out of our backsides. The FBI reached that conclusion in May of 2020, almost 3 years ago, a few months into the pandemic. The Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in California determined that the COVID-19 coronavirus most likely came from a lab leak at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Now, the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is not technically a part of the Energy Department, but it is largely funded by them. And its report, which was a U.S. government report. This isn't some tinfoil hat guy in his off-the-grid cabin in Idaho. This is a premier scientific research facility. The Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory determined that the COVID-19 coronavirus most likely resulted from a lab leak in Wuhan, China. But if you said that at the time, you were called a conspiracy theorist, you were censored from social media, your posts were taken down, you were suspended, you were mocked by the Democrats and their allies in the propaganda press. Why? Because Dr. Fakey, Dr. Fascist, Dr. Fauci said, that's not what caused it. It came from an animal. Despite there being no evidence that it came from an animal. But Dr. Fauci kept saying that it wasn't a lab leak. And his word, of course, was gospel back then. Still is, frankly, to the lefties. They still worship the guy. And yet nearly everything Dr. Fauci said turned out to be false. Sometimes it turned out to be false the very next day. That guy's statements had the shelf life of bananas on a kitchen counter. Don't wear a mask. Oh, no, definitely wear a mask. No problem going out in public. Oh, no, stay home. Oh, you can go safely to school. Oh, keep kids home from school forever. How Dr. Fauci had any credibility whatsoever is beyond me. But the reason he had the credibility is because he had the media's attention. And he had the media's support. Why did he have that? Because Dr. Fauci regularly denounced President Trump. He would go on the air regularly to refute something that Donald Trump said, to say that Donald Trump was wrong, even though what Fauci was giving was his opinion. And so Dr. Fauci's words were considered by the establishment press, the fake news, as the nectar of the gods, not to be questioned. But do you know who was the first person in a position of authority to say that the virus originated out of a lab in Wuhan, China? It was President Trump who said that. And Dr. Fauci and others denounced the president for saying that. I suspect, and that's all it is a suspicion on my part, that U.S. intelligence services determined that it came from a lab leak out of that Wuhan Institute of Virology and informed the president of that in their classified briefings. And whether the president should have said so publicly, because the information, after all, was classified, well, perhaps not. And maybe that's why the establishment attacked him for it. I don't know. Of course, the president also has the sole unilateral authority to declassify information, so if he wanted it declassified, well, it's declassified. He can say what he wants. But Dr. Fauci, the Democrats, and the fake news were so heavily invested in the animal-to-human transmission theory that even when the government came out and said it was a lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan, China, they still could not bring themselves to acknowledge it. They still poo-pooed and questioned that conclusion. There's no way that could be the case. Dr. Fauci said otherwise. And Donald Trump said it was. Well, Trump can't be right, and Fauci can't be wrong. And as a result, that whole groupthink, despite all the evidence, despite all the logic and reason, despite all the analysis of what makes sense and what doesn't make sense, the official narrative was it was an animal-to-human transmission that occurred naturally. When what probably really happened was the Wuhan Institute was engaged in gain-of-function research, funded, by the way, with a program Dr. Fauci approved, and lied to Congress about when asked by Senator Ron Paul, for which he ought to be brought up on perjury charges, but won't be because the Department of Justice is so heavily politicized. China, of course, has disputed that conclusion, but China has also refused to cooperate in on-site investigations and has refused to provide documents to aid any investigations into the origins of COVID. And they're not just refusing to cooperate with U.S. investigators. The Communist Chinese are refusing to cooperate with the World Health Organization, too. Now, why is that? If the Chinese were so confident that their lab wasn't the source of the virus, wouldn't they be eager to allow unfettered access that would prove it didn't come from them? Methinks thou doth protesteth too much. So yes, COVID-19 came from China. It came from a lab in China. It came from a bioweapons lab in China. Was it intentionally released? Without evidence that it was, I could argue that it was, but it would be pure speculation and that would be irresponsible. So I'll only say vis-a-vis that I wouldn't put it past the Communist Chinese to do that. But I'm not saying they did either. Unfortunately, the communists in China are not this country's biggest enemies. This country's biggest enemies are the communists in the Democratic Party.